So good morning to you. This is actually a contribution from the Global Environment Facility, and I'm on the science panel, have been for 8 years, trying to help the Global Environment Facility develop strategies that involve science and scientific quality. And I've looked after the focal area on land degradation, and I'm now particularly involved with multifocal projects. So that's the projects particularly that pick up elements from biodiversity and land degradation and climate change and hopefully produce multiple benefits. And again, for those of you perhaps not familiar with the Global Environment Facility, it is the pot of money set up after the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 that then funds developing countries in order to maintain their commitments under the global conventions, and the three big global conventions, obviously the Biodiversity Convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. But just to pick up there on my title, at the heart of gaining wider attention for soil biodiversity is the process of getting it factored into policy and practice at a variety of scales, and I'm particularly obviously going to be looking at the global scale. And what we in the science panel, that's the STAP, the STAP, Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel of the GEF, what we've known is that the caricature of scientists just speaking to scientists and policymakers just speaking to politicians, and the two never coming to a meeting of minds. Well, that caricature is actually not true. And I want to assure you that it's possible even to make a subject as unknown or as unloved as soil biodiversity into an issue that can be factored into policy in order to achieve, and this is the important point, to achieve, in this case, environmental benefits and human development. It's not easy, and we've got a long way to go, but it is doable provided we work at the process. And that word mainstreaming is the process. Now, I don't like the emasculation of the English language, and mainstreaming is a word that has crept up on us. It's a bit like trying to get a urine sample into a small bottle for a medical test. But mainstreaming is often used as a verb, and it's been applied to a wide range of domains. We hear of mainstreaming gender into development policy, for example, and I've been involved with the United Nations Development Programme on mainstreaming poverty and environment into human development. So it is a much used term, but what does it mean? Well, mainstreaming biodiversity was developed as a means of addressing the fact that biodiversity conservation goals are viewed as distinct from, and sometimes even contradictory to, the goals of development and economic growth. So a higher priority, therefore, has to be placed on development, which inevitably means that biodiversity work doesn't receive the political, social, and financial support it needs in order to succeed. So in a sense, mainstreaming is that process of inserting biodiversity priorities, biodiversity goals, into the wider stream of national development policy and practice. And it's more than just integration. It has the added sense of modifying that into which it is integrated. So, for example, it should aim to change the focus of development policies and interventions towards incorporating the values of biodiversity. Anyway, these points have been made much more eloquently by others. Here's a quote. This is from the Conference of Parties to the Biodiversity Convention. It's 12 years ago, but nothing has really changed. It reads, as you can see there, the most important lesson of the last 10 years is that the objectives of the convention will be impossible to meet until consideration of biodiversity is fully integrated into other sectors. And I guess we would all subscribe to that. And the quote actually goes on to say that the need to mainstream the conservation and sustainable use of biological resources across all sectors of the national economy and society, and the policy-making framework is a complex challenge, and I would certainly agree with that too. So all countries, virtually all countries, are signatories to the Convention on Biodiversity, and in a sense biodiversity has therefore been mainstreamed. But in reality, because it's a subtle and elusive argument to support the importance of biodiversity to human society, the issue is then often overtaken by more pressing problems: Ebola, AIDS, HIV, floods, droughts, and we could go on. Biodiversity will get shoved down the list of priorities. But is there a convincing scientific case for the mainstreaming of soil biodiversity? By the fact that so many have signed up for this conference, I guess implicitly there is. So why is it? Why is it an issue? Well, I would not be here for a start. The Global Environment Facility and its science panel, which I represent, believes passionately that there is a scientific case for mainstreaming biodiversity. And here's a quote from our CEO and chairperson of the GEF, a Japanese woman, and she says, "Our core message is that there can be no separation between development and environment, as they are codependent, and healthy ecosystems are essential to secure human health, food, energy, and water, and ultimately sustainable development." So making the pragmatic case that biodiversity has to be included, has to be mainstreamed. So that's the fundamental role of the organization that I'm representing here, is to demonstrate biodiversity's utility and value to that global policy community, which also consists obviously of national representatives. And here we've got two recent initiatives of our science panel, which I'm going to just briefly mention. On the left is the Mainstreaming Biodiversity in Practice advisory paper, which was published earlier this year, and its purpose is, and I quote from it, "to actively support a new biodiversity conservation paradigm," that is biodiversity mainstreaming, which is the process of embedding biodiversity considerations into policies, strategies, and practices. So it's a challenge, and our advisory paper here actually outlines some ways, and I'll be picking up a few of those ways towards the end of this talk. And then on the right-hand side is the Managing Soil Organic Carbon for Global Benefits. And soil organic carbon has been seen for us for now about 5 years as one of the key integrators across all of the focal areas of the global environment. And it obviously is a proxy for soil biodiversity. It's a proxy for carbon sequestration and therefore climate change mitigation and adaptation. And it's also a proxy for a healthy soil and therefore resistance to soil degradation. So it's a key variable. And so we are now prioritizing soil organic carbon in the new land degradation strategy, and it's also in the biodiversity strategy. And what this technical paper does, it demonstrates that sustainable land management has the potential to contribute many things, such as food security and multiple global environmental outcomes. And that includes obviously the protection of biodiversity, both above and below ground, includes the resilience of ecosystems, and as I mentioned, climate change, mitigation, sustainable land management, and protecting the environment from things like persistent organic pollutants. So soil organic carbon, therefore, is one means that we see, perhaps the most important means of delivering both global environmental benefits and important items on the human development agenda, such as food security. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to draw on these two papers and the information we've collated on biodiversity. Here we have, and we're not to read it, but here is the GEF fifth replenishment, GEF 5 program outcome, and this is 2010 to 2014, and biodiversity features right up there, high in the priorities, just over $1 billion allocated, just over a quarter of the total budget to biodiversity, broadly the same as what is allocated to climate change. So in the big picture, the GEF serves biodiversity relatively well. And in part, that is because of pressure from the donors, the developed countries, such as France, such as US and Japan and so on, the big donors, and they have prioritized biodiversity for us. So for GEF 6, this is the sixth replenishment, which has just started this July. We have 30 donor countries that have pledged $4.34 billion in total, and with $1.296 billion for biodiversity, or 29.9, nearly 30% of the funds for biodiversity. So on the face of it, biodiversity is increasing in relative importance. But there is perhaps particular technical reasons why that is so, which I don't need to go into. But in terms of financing, biodiversity is very much mainstreamed internationally. So in the GEF 6 strategy, and the strategy here at objective level, there are four GEF strategy objectives that reflect the broad aims of the Convention on Biodiversity. That's the conservation, the sustainable use, and the equitable sharing of biodiversity, but no explicit mention of soil biodiversity at outcome level. Nevertheless, mainstreaming is there as the fourth objective, and this reflects not only the strategic plan of the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also, many of you will be familiar with the Aichi targets. And strategic goal A is to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. Again, a big challenge, but embedded in there is going to be soil biodiversity. As an aside, the UNCCD, that's the Desertification Convention, and the GEF strategy for land degradation is more firmly entrenched on issues that relate to soils and to sustainable production. And it does invite, and we have, and that was something that our science panel managed to do, actually insert the term healthy soils, because that was a term that the policymakers could accept. But of course, that really is soil biodiversity by another name. So what lessons do we have in mainstreaming biodiversity? Well, got a few there, that we've got the investments that have been achieved, $1.6 billion since 2003, 327 mainstreaming projects in 135 countries, so that's a large body of information. A good evidence base established as to how biodiversity can be better integrated, and it provides somehow a lead for how we might promote soil biodiversity much more strongly within that whole community of biodiversity projects, so that it has greater resonance. And two broad conclusions we come to. Firstly, that mainstreaming is not just a controlled experiment, but it's rather a social experiment in changing the value structures of institutions and individuals. And that should have the vital consequence for the natural world and for humans who rely on biodiversity and the services that it provides. So while mainstreaming may not prove amenable to rigorous testing, it does deserve more systematic inquiry, and it does even from a scientist's we need to think now, what does mainstreaming involve? And I've got a slide on that in a moment, and how can we help that process? But another broad conclusion is on governance. And good governance and strong institutions are key determinants of project success or failure. And a balance needs to be struck between working in countries and working in sectors where there is sufficiently strong governance capacity for mainstreaming outcomes. And that then, if there is, then our projects have a greater chance of success and of actually changing society for the better, and therefore tackling the most pressing situations where we have problems on this planet. But there is a further important conclusion, is that mainstreaming, as we've really discussed in slightly other context at this conference, is a complex, costly process. It takes a long time, decades, even a generation, to achieve impact at scale and across sectors. And the transaction costs can be very high, and in some cases we need much more emphasis on better design of projects, better monitoring, better evaluation, and indeed publication of our results, the sorts of things that Mike Swift was talking about just a moment ago. So what are the key determinants then for mainstreaming success? I'm not going to go through this because I've got the red light showing, but it's going to involve project design and implementation. I just want to pick up number one on that slide, though. That is embedded in a theory or theories of change. Because only if we have a good theory of change, that is, what do we hope? What's not just the output, but what is the outcome of our activities to achieve? So what are we going to change? What's going to be influenced? And what's the process of getting to that? The pathways. That's absolutely essential, and we need to include those in project design. The other ones I hope are fairly obvious. Project strategic alignment is also involved, as is the social context and leadership. And let's face it too, one of our major limitations, especially in developing countries, is the lack of human capacity to deal with not only biodiversity, but also obviously soil biodiversity. I was going to talk more about soil organic carbon, but Philippe wants me to get off in just a moment. So what does soil organic carbon do? Well, it does deliver multiple benefits. It integrates soil management, soil quality, crop yields. The link between soil organic carbon levels and crop yields has captured scientific attention, and so then again that is one of the entry points that we can utilize to make soil biodiversity more important. And I think we also need a greater vision, and one of the visionary things that has crept up on us in the last couple of years is climate smart agriculture, because climate change has become so politically resonant. But what about biodiversity smart agriculture? There's a possibility for us. So the message is that we can and should look forward to a time when soil biodiversity is an accepted and a loved item on the national and international psyche, taking its place alongside climate change. But for now, we have a little bit more work to do. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Michael. Comment, question? No? Okay. There is a question here? Okay.
Thank you very much. Brilliant presentation. For the donor countries who are so keen that the developing world integrate and mainstream biodiversity, how do we make the donor countries practice what they preach?
That's a very good question. I have to say that I think the donor countries are represented usually by their ministries of environment, which are usually the weakest ministries in the array of ministries, certainly not the finance ministries. So they have relatively little power at home, so they exercise their power globally. I know that's a very strange outcome, but yes.